Welcome to the Digital Diary, Adventures of a Computerized Quilter. So today we're going to talk about the many uses of borders. One interesting use of borders is to update a quilt. This was a quilt that this customer had added some brand new borders to antique quilts to bring them up to date and add a little sparkle to them, and they turned out adorable. She didn't want them stitched as borders because of all the colors, but I just wanted to bring up that adding borders can update quilts. In this quilt, this border was picked, and the sashings and borders, to accent the fabric. There was a lot of stripes and dots in the fabric, so I used piano keys and circles in the sashings to accentuate the fabrics in the quilt. Now this particular border and sashings were used to simplify. There was so much going on and such detailed quilting in this quilt that I used sashings to divide. In this particular quilt, the borders and sashings were just used to accentuate the blocks, but not accentuate the actual sashing. It was meant to blend in so that it brought the blocks out.
Oh, well, I love the sashing on there. To me, that's more like an elaborate frame on a painting or something. Mm-hmm. It becomes part of the overall look.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted them all to be consistent because there was so much different things going on in the blocks. So another thing that I do a lot with borders is to use them as we originally think of borders, as a frame to accentuate the quilt. So in this case, I use piano keys with the swags to border this quilt to frame it, to bring out the inner beauty of the quilt. Now this quilt was borders, borders, borders. And so in this quilt, I wanted to blend and divide the areas without causing too much interruption of the design elements of the pastel flowers. And so with this quilt, it was just meant to bring out the fabric, the floral fabric, and make it stand out, and divide the areas. And then in this quilt, there's so many borders that I wanted to stop the eye from going from one to the other so that there was a division. So I made them drastically different with the curve hatch in the one border section, just to draw a line so that the eye could rest in the other areas with the flowers. And this quilt had so much going on that I used the borders and the sashing to help bring out some of the internal elements. There was a lot of circles, there was polka dot fabric in the edges, and so I used draw triangle border in the edges, and then I kept the circles going in the sashings just to blend, because each block was so different, and each block was only 6 by 6, so they were tiny, and so I didn't want to compete with all the different designs in the block, so I just kept this one simple. So in this case, the border was meant to just accentuate but keep it simple. So now let's talk to Georgia Stahl about some of her different uses of borders.
Okay, this was a little quilt, and if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see what the pattern looked like. But as it went around, it was half square triangles. So I actually used fill. I used that pattern that's in the bottom, and I put it in the triangle with fill, but with the outside, where it cuts through the middle, and then used a point-to-point triangle that filled in the black part. I just thought it made it a lot more interesting and fill really allows us to do different things with our patterns than we normally expect.
I like the fact that you kept the scale the same from your corner to your next triangle. Even though it's a slightly larger area, the scale is similar enough that your eye just stays with it.
Right, because actually once you, and I turned it, and you can't see the whole quilt, but I turned it so it would go one direction, then the other, then, you know, it did a chevron look as it went across. So you had to think real hard as you're doing it to make sure you keep it going. But it worked really well, I thought. It just made it very interesting.
And I like the color of binding that you put on there too, to add that additional frame of the leaf color. Mm-hmm.
That's actually another border, and I did piano keys in that border.
Oh, okay.
Because I didn't bind this one. It's actually a piano key border on the outside, just to kind of simplify it, because again, you know, here's the drama in the black and red, and I just wanted it simple in the framing of the green fabric on the outside. And she wanted it really simple in the background, just echoing around the applique. She wanted everything else fairly simple. I put, you know, some leaf work in, but obviously the drama in this quilt is this red and black border.
I like that you used a contrasting thread in it. It really makes it stand out.
Yes.
I love thread, and I like to see it. You know, that's one thing I've seen change a lot through the years, is people used to like everything to disappear, and I'm seeing more and more people, they want the contrast, they want to see the quilting, and it makes it fun.
Yeah, I really like that thread color on there.
It's my favorite color, military gold.
Yeah.
Okay, I included this picture because we all have gotten quilts that have so many borders, and you can see just on the outside of the quilt, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 borders. And number one, it's a lot more work to put in 5 separate borders. Number two, I think it's sometimes difficult to get borders that really look good together and don't end up with that sort of, shall we say, cluttered look, because you have so many stacked. And I just was looking through my patterns, trying to figure out what to do, and I just saw this pattern and realized I could elongate the piano key portion as much as I needed to, and then I had the I call it blooming feather or flower on the outside part. So what happened is I thought it framed it beautifully. It just opened up the quilt by having that frame as it went around the quilt. I really loved how it turned out. And I can tell you, it was so much less work than if I had put in 5 separate borders. So that helps keep the cost down for the customer. And it turned out right.
You definitely covered all those borders. I think that's a great idea.
It actually wasn't military gold. It's what I wanted to do, grays and silvers, because of the cool colors. But the customer, her husband, decided everything has to be custom quilted now, and you can't even see the black stitching behind that upper black. Yeah. And he insisted that it be gold, and you're like, oh. You know, so you do the conversation about.
That would not be my recommendation.
My favorite words are, you might want to consider, but he had his mind made up, and he's paying the bill, so, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it turned out beautiful. And they really are the same color gold. It just looks different because of lighting. So I think it was actually a little bit brighter than military gold, but customer's choice.
Yep.
Yeah, if I were using that pattern, I would have flipped it and put the feathery bits towards the inside and the piano key out towards the border.
I tried it, and I didn't like it. I tried, but it just seemed like it needed to open up on the outside. I tried it both.
Depends on what corner pattern you have, too.
Right. Well, actually, it was Kim Diamond, and she actually, I think, had it opened up the other way, and I asked her to turn it around. because I just didn't like it. So,
Oh, well, and that's a very good point. It's all based on your corner.
right.
I do these things a lot that have a piano key on one side or the other, and the corner is what determines it.
And the key thing about using piano key is there's a lot of freedom if the border isn't perfectly straight. A whole lot of freedom as it stitches up to it and comes right back out. Yay.
Yes.
Yay.
But yeah, it is interesting how versatile piano keys are. You could use that border either way if you had an alternative corner. That is really neat. And
Absolutely.
and piano keys are my favorite for wavy borders.
Because they suck up a lot of fabric. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, you can control it better.
Uh-huh.
On a wavy border, I will go through and put 2-inch piano keys, go back and put 1 inch in between them, and that really does divide up that full border. So, and piano keys are really one of my go-tos. You may see it in my a few of my quilts.
So this one, a couple of things. I really like using coordinating patterns a little bit, but I don't like coordinating to the where every single thing looks very coordinated, because I think it becomes very generic and could almost be an edge to edge. So you can see that I have the coordinating in the outside border as well as in the border. Actually, those were triangles in the bottom, but I had this interesting thing where I had a border going straight like we normally expect them, but the inside part had a border going at 90 degrees or 45 degrees, excuse me. So what I chose to do is use that, it's called garden crest, that crest border, and I did a fill. I positioned it so it was exactly over that point, and I did a fill. And it did take a little planning because I had to hit on all 4 corners exactly that way. So I had to play with sizing a lot. But then the other borders are at the 45 degree, and they were different. They had more curls and swirls that coordinated, but they weren't from the same, the same plan or the same group of patterns. And I think that makes it a little bit more interesting sometimes.
Yeah, that's another great use of borders and using fill. Well, now we'll move on to Christine Perigo, and we'll see some of her beautiful quilts and the way she uses borders.
Okay, so you're wondering why I have this in our borders thing. Mostly because I do a lot of modern quilts. Modern quilts typically do not have borders, but I use my border patterns in some interesting ways. So this is really a use of a border pattern. The contrasting thread that I used in that curved section, I used apply with the border pattern to get this effect. So I included it here because it's like a border, it's just like a curved border. So know that you can do these sorts of effects just by using things like apply to get a different result.
I've used borders as background in blocks very often, especially some people have a category called fill borders that sew down and back up, and they'll work effectively as a background fill in a block too. That's gorgeous.
That is.
Yeah, it just glows. I love it.
Okay, so this quilt, I didn't have any borders on it, but it had a whole bunch of negative space off to one side. And so I literally used just a single row of border and put it into that negative space to help me divide up that area and make it a whole lot easier to stitch. So again, I'm laying out those border patterns, but I'm not necessarily using all of them, right? I'm just using pieces and parts here and there.
And you're not going with the piecing, you're going right across it. I love that.
creating my own.
Yes. That really made that quilt. That's beautiful.
Make texture.
Double that. So here's another example
Oh,
of
there it
me
is again.
going off the reservation. This quilt is another modern quilt, does not have any borders on it, but to kind of ground it and give it a little bit of a more traditional feel, a little bit of depth, I added a border to it. So use this, set it up in border corner, and then just selected the patterns that I wanted to use and deleted the rest and positioned them and stitched them out.
That adds so much interest to that quilt.
Definitely. So here's my version of scallops, Gina.
Oh, yes.
So this is piano keys and scallops, and I actually scalloped the edge. This is one of my quilts. And I specifically went and stitched out the scallops and then filled it in. But then after I got all of those stitched, I actually went and stitched out the scalloped edge that I was going to trim so that I knew where to go back and trim when I was going to go to cut those scallops.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's great.
It's a lot easier if somebody's bringing you a customer quilt and they want scallops, it's so much easier if they give you the whole piece of fabric on there and let you give them a cutting line. And it's easier for them
Yes.
too.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Very nice.
So this is yet another example of me using a border, but not using all of it. So definitely using fill and going and filling in the patterns that get cut in half or cut by that other pattern. But just using the pieces and parts of that border design that I really wanted to.
And you're not going by piecing lines. You can't possibly be. I love this.
Yes.
Yep. I've completely abandoned any piecing lines because, quite frankly, there were no piecing lines out there, and I created the border effect just by putting the quilting in it.
It's nice.
That is really stunning.
So this is yet another one of me putting a border where it didn't exist. This one does kind of follow the piecing. It goes around those star patterns and in between them. And quite frankly, on this quilt, I didn't realize that I was going to put the border there until I got it on my machine. And I could see the path that the border would take running in between each of those star blocks, and I went for it.
Well, I love the going from the cream to the black.
Mhm.
So is that the same
Yes.
color thread or did you switch thread?
Yeah, I switched threads.
Yeah,
So
I love it.
it's a fill on one side with the white, and then a fill on the other side with the charcoal, and making sure they meet in the middle. And obviously, I'm not doing machine tie-ups.
Another great use of a border there.
Out of the box borders.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to talk about some of Deanne Perigo's quilts.
Well, this quilt was an out of Africa quilt. It was fabrics that my husband brought home from Africa, and so I wanted to showcase borders around it that came from Lily Street. And Marcy from Lily Street had all these African borders that went together. And so I just found ways of using them around the blocks, and even at the top and the bottom where you see that segment that is different, that's a border as well. I just popped it in there, similar to a sachet.
Beautiful texture.
Yes. And it adds to to the design of the quilt. That
Well,
is
I
really.
like how you used it to bring your eye around
Mm-hmm.
the center block.
Mhm.
Because hidden within that center is actually a lion's head that you only really see on the back of the quilt.
Oh.
And this quilt, the top of it is actually a big long border. And it just shows that sometimes putting a hand-guided fill in a border allows the applique to stand up and poof out some more and just fill in behind with something fun. And it is so much fun for me to drop those belts every so often and just play.
I like how you call it play, because that's about it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The whole quilting experience to me is nothing but fun.
Yes.
Okay, this one was an interesting one in that it had 4 borders. And the center piece border was just a continuation of the waves that were on the center of the quilt. And then, of course, a piano key on the outside, like we've talked about a bit. But this was one of those quilts where the cable border that the customer wanted, to fit the space, it was too large to chunk down the side. So this was definitely one of those opportunities I had to do some chunking down the side and turn the quilt and do some more. So.
I like how that goes with the quilt. I like that cable border. It really, and you used a contrasting thread, I see. That really looks nice. Now here's a few quilts from Paige, and she's going to show us some other alternative uses of borders.
I really do like borders, and traditionally I will use borders, I guess, using border corner, and then I do that to get the corners, and then I use a ply to get the edges. That would be my traditional way, and that's the quilt I have behind me. Piano key is really one of my go-tos. I will use it especially over a very patterned fabric because it doesn't compete. It is calming. And on this quilt, I've used a wavy piano key, and I put it on at a 45. So I put it on one time across the quilt, and then I flipped it and went back, and that gave me the wavy crosshatch. And I believe the next picture is going to show you the corner. So the corner here is a little trickier on these. You'll notice where I have that pin, that particular line is dramatically longer than the rest of the quilt. So because to get to the corner, when I cut that corner, I need to start with a pattern that is like two and a half times the width of my border, and then I use fill to cut it down, and that is only to give me that corner. So piano keys truly are my go-to. I use them in all different sizes.
I love the way you did that corner. That is really amazing.
And you can set up one corner and then you don't know what you're getting until you get to the other one because of shrinkage. So what I'll do is I will do all of one direction all the way around, and I do turn my quilts. I'm not a chunker. And then coming back, especially with a piano key, you want to make sure those things fit when you get to the last edge where they have to come together. So that one's fun. Usually with piano keys, I chunk. This is, we've talked about a design that has a piano key that goes with it. This is a good use when you have a border that one side is not the same as the other. If you look at the piano key portion, the side borders on this quilt were a different height than the top and the bottom. And so this is my way to deal with that, is is by using the piano key, because I can make it shorter or longer. And it really worked well with this.
That is a really good use of that border, and you can't
This
tell.
is the back of the quilt. I didn't even show you the front of the quilt, but it shows up so well here.
Good
so
idea.
It was not a whole cloth. This is the back.
But that's
It's
a
really
great
way. It's such a good way, though, to deal with those just size differences, because
Yes.
at least a couple of times a year I end up with borders like that.
Yeah, and you can see that this quilt was nothing more than a series of borders. You go down further in, and my theme, of course, is feathers. I try to really pay attention to scale when I'm going throughout a quilt, and to scale things proportionately. So when you go down into the center, you'll see that my plumes are smaller, but they still kind of fit with the smaller plumes from the outside. And my stop border is nothing more than just one of those plumes.
Was that a flying geese border?
Yes, that is flying geese. That's actually two of my patterns that are in there, and I love those. Yeah, I like flying geese, and I'm not a really good feather person. I didn't do a lot of them freehand, but when I can put them in with a computer, I like it.
That is beautiful. Oh, I love this one.
Okay, so we had talked a little bit about scallops. I love it. This is one of my services that I will quilt a quilt, and you can see on the left here where I've done, and actually it was a page turner throughout the entire quilt, but I then put the scallops on, and if you'll notice that my dips and my points coordinate with where the border, the sashing comes into the quilt. And that was designed on purpose to accentuate both the inside and the outside of this quilt. We did do the binding on this, and it has a piping with it.
Ooh, the black is awesome.
Yeah, it's actually a green that is so dark it looks black, and a bright persimmon red with gold thread.
Yeah, there you go.
Wow.
But I think on this, the border treatment really made a difference on the overall effect of the quilt.
Totally.
It really did. The pictures of before and after that border, that scalloping, really show the difference of what you can do to accentuate the quilt. That's awesome.
Yep, they're not an afterthought. Borders, you got to plan these things in advance. And so the pattern for the scalloping was just that, a pattern. Okay, I've got two go-to borders that I will use over and over: piano keys and triangle borders, where I'm fitting two triangles together. And on the quilt on the left, you can see where I've used those triangles, obviously within the body of the quilt. If you take the same triangle and apply them to the outside, you get a very dramatic frame. And this is a very plain fabric on the outside, muslin, so I needed something that was going to keep your eye moving and finish this quilt off, not just plain out there. So with triangle borders, you have one pattern's coming down and then the other patterns fitting up into them. On the quilt on the right, the red is a triangle as well that just fits into each other. And in that tan border, if you notice in the star points, not between the star points, that's the pattern. And I put it up into the border, but because of the dimensions, I had to make it a slightly different size. So it's the same thing, only different. So the patterns, and now I know I would have tried to make that border fit the block somehow. This quilt I did a few years ago, and now I'm a little bit better at making those things fit. But I'm just using a triangle pattern again in my border. I wanted to show you something more than the traditional stuff. Okay, on this quilt, that space was disproportionate to the rest of the quilt, the border space. So what I did was I broke it down by putting in an area that puffed up. What is up is noticed. And I used a piano key with pearls behind it to flatten that out. But that really brings your eye around that quilt. This is a very happy quilt.
It is.
It is. And the effect of breaking that up is marvelous.
Yeah, the white space was too much for the rest of the quilt.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel it was balanced. Here's another example of breaking up the space. And I needed to break it up, but I wanted the elements to be proportionate with like the roses. And this was an antique quilt that someone had done embroidery, hand embroidery on.
Mhm.
And so I broke that up again, and this time I did it by putting in a border, echoing it, and using the other area with just a hand stipple to tamp it down. I put a small row of arcs in to give a stop border where there was none. And then I used piano key on the outside. And this again was a customer quilt that we got piping on it, and we're just about to do, well, I think it is finished. There's a pin up there that's making it look funny. But again, a before and after, and borders have to scale to the rest of the quilt, in my opinion. So that was my attempt to make that big open area fit the rest of the quilt.
And when you look at one side and then the other, it's amazing what you did for that quilt with that border. It really accented and brought that whole quilt to life.
Yeah, it almost doesn't look like the same quilt. You'd have to look at it and go, it is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what a difference. It's
This
beautiful.
was a vintage, I don't know if it was meant to be the center of something. It had the blue lines on it, which of course I totally ignored. And but they had embroidered it very nicely done.
Yes.
Someone found it in an attic.
Nice treasure.
Yes.
Okay, here is border on border on border again. And I am trying very hard to maintain my scale. So you'll see there is the leafy border that runs through the outside, and then the third border in are the same width. And then if you get to the next border in after that, it is not. So what I did do was I went into the design, and using the nodes, I pulled out some sections to make it less dense, so I could maintain that density. And again, I'm showing you the front and the back here. I love cables because they give you such a distinct difference from something that's the leafy here. And anything that has parallel lines will draw your eyes. So the cables were really drawing your eyes, and you can see I used them in the sashing. The blocks on this quilt are all on point, and then I used it again on the outside. And the curved cross hatching, another one of my go-tos. Anytime I have something with blocks on point, and we get a lot of different variations of this, I like to put that curved cross hatch in there. And because it's a point to point, you can just click across a whole bunch of area and it just goes.
And it makes a square piecing pattern into something round.
Yes.
And that was going to go with my rounded cable.
That pulls it all together. That is a great use of those borders. And I like how you use the nodes to alter the size of the one so that it would be the same density. That's amazing.
The only downside to this quilt is it was a block of the month from a local quilt shop, so I had 12 of them.
Oh.
But once I did the pattern work, I had it.
Yep.
I like to pull the inside of the quilt out. Now, this was a quilt that had a lot going on, and so I was doing things with patterns and channels in the blocks themselves. And even though there's a border out there, I kind of disregarded the border. I pulled what I was doing on the inside out. So I continued with the same patterns, the same feel. And how I achieve this is I do use a piece of grid, and I will chalk marks on that quilt so I know where my patterns are supposed to start and stop, and then just do a fill on the outside edge. But you can see where the lines of my channels just keep going.
That's
right behind. And I only did one of these.
That's pretty though. I like the extra lines just going out. And there isn't a real border in the quilt anyway. If you look at it, it's very non-traditional, that's for sure.
That's another really neat way to tackle borders, is by bringing the inside out.
Yeah, I do that a lot. In fact, here's another one. This is a series of concatenating draw patterns. There's 16 patterns in this, how I click this out. And the block that's in the center, so take a look at the tan square. If you go right down below that, it's half of it, but I quilted the entire block as if it were there. So I just continued the pattern out into the border and disregarded the border, even though it's there. I did stitch in the ditch that border. That was the only thing that was stitched in the ditch on this quilt. The rest of it was all draw pattern with point to point and concatenate.
Well, this is great. It gives us so many good ideas of how to make our quilts more interesting with borders.
Here again, no border, and I brought what was in the interior of the quilt out. I was just pretending those red dots, the same thing that was under there that I did a fill around. So that's taking it out over the edge. I guess you could call it off the edge.
Yeah.
Off the edge quilting.
I do that a lot with most of my quilts, so it was after my heart. I know that.
Yeah, that one was fun. Okay, so in the theme of taking the inside out, this is a series of squares that I just did point-to-point triangles on, a bunch of page turners. There is a flying geese border all the way around this. I did do point-to-point arcs around the flying geese, and then I did a fill omitting the quilting just over the flying geese. So on the next one, you'll see what the pattern is. So this is the actual click out of that quilt where the patterns are there, and once you get rid of the patterns, you definitely have a border out there that is created by doing clicking out point to point.
Very creative.
That showed us some great ways to think outside of the box and use borders for unique ways and do interesting things to build the interest in our quilts. Using borders or bringing the inside out, not using the borders. Very creative ways to handle borders. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like pulling a quilt out of a box that has a lot of borders and doing some exciting things. Yeah, I'm really motivated.
Yeah, seeing other people's quilts always motivates me to do more myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and inspiration to take it down a different road, maybe.
I hope that we inspired you as well from our diaries of digital quilting.
All right.
Bye.